questions. We can go a little over if we get excited because we started a little late. Does anyone have any questions? Come on now, we've got coffee. You have to have questions. It's sort of the exchange that we're talking about, right? Exchange A? A. Yes. Okay, so we got some over here. Okay. And one over here too. Excellent.
Thank you both. Just fantastic stuff. It's just really, really provocative. Let me just throw out a couple of comments to see what you all want to do with them that connects both of the papers. But Mary Daly says in Wikidary that it's a lesbian socialism. She says blood flows, capital doesn't flow. And there's a way in China now that there's this hydro-socialist movement in China that says very similar thing, Rolando. But without the nuances that I think you put here, is just a beautiful talk. Thank you. With the nuances between two different relations, power from above, power from below. Whose concept is that again?
El León Hebreo was a Neoplatonic philosopher translated by Garcilaso de la Vega, and then Garcilaso Andeanizes these different categories and adapts them to the Andean hydrological cycle that connects everything together.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, well, they say in China the Shihui Juizhe, so it's literally a hydro-socialism. They say that water, because the neoliberal discourse of capital flows, and it's come in so quickly, just in 25 years. They're saying no, water flows, capital stomps. It slays and it stomps. So anyway, those are just...
Water flows and blood flows.
Yeah, water and blood.
Yeah. We'll get Nora's question and then Mariko's, and then I'll let you answer questions.
Yes, thank you very much for both presentations. They're always very thought-provoking. I have a question to Marcy. I like very much the way you argued, but I also have my doubts. And one doubt is, can you actually deduce a process that works without conscience, as you yourself said, in general's way, deduce from that a way of thinking and feeling? You know, because I don't think there is a real relationship between the way in which the womb is generous and the way in which we think and feel. Why should there be a relationship?
You mean in the sense that the womb could be generous without the
without,
mind wanting to be
the
generous?
person
Yeah.
within which it
Yeah.
is situated to be
Yeah.
generous. And love, and also maternal love, is not only ambivalent, it's a very contradictory thing, can be not just tough, but can also be deadly. So, I mean, I think it's always a bit problematic to see this just as good things, you know, that we can learn from. They're also very contradictory processes and feelings.
Excellent. Let's get Mariko's question.
Hi, thank you both for really creative and interesting talks. I have a question for Marcy. First of all, I really enjoyed a very thought-provoking presentation. And so my question for you is, so you say that capital and the state have an interest in controlling the womb, and broadly that seems, you know, to make a lot of sense to me. My question is, how much do you think there's actual consciousness on the part of the capitalist class to want to control the womb? Or is it just so couched in, like, especially in this country, in a religious ethos that it's, I mean, is the capital class really consciously thinking of, you lay out how it's so important, but are they even aware of that?
Okay, and if you could turn that light off. That's a little, feel a little bit interrogated up here, but okay, here you go.
Great questions. And I'm sorry, what was your name? Mark. A quick comment on that. I know that is directed to Orlando, but I think it's really interesting, and it just calls to mind that, you know, yeah, blood flows, water flows, capital doesn't. What capital does is accumulate. And in Chinese medicine, I mean, that stagnation actually presents like a challenge to, for example, fertility. That is, there's a tension. And what was your name again? Laura. I'm sorry?
Laura with N.
Lauren.
Nora.
Nora, I'm sorry. So yes, I think I have two comments in response to just kind of underscore points that I was trying to make, but clearly didn't make well enough. So yes, there is a distinction between why people have children, why a woman, for example, may want to have a child, and the principle that is at work, I argue, in the womb. And I think the tension here is clear by the fact that frequently the womb often sets to work without a woman wanting it to, right? I mean, it's like, like Simone de Beauvoir says, I mean, the body of woman is sort of an alien thing that can like do something that she doesn't necessarily want it to do. So I'm trying to make a distinction between the principle that would guide a person's decision to carry the pregnancy to term, or not, because all kinds of principles may determine that, and what is the kind of logic at work in the process of gestation itself. And I think that process, the logic that I see in it is a generous one, which is not necessarily good. It's not necessarily good. I mean, I think to Batai's point, generosity is in some ways the problem. When more money, more problems, right? So I don't think that it's necessarily good. I agree with you that the maternal power is very ambivalent. I mean, thus my sort of invoking the praying mantis and kind of ants and bees. I mean, there's nothing romantic to me about this, but rather I think what's compelling is that it illustrates that the kind of reality of life, the precondition for human life, is this generosity principle, which strikes very directly at capital's sort of imposition of scarcity. So I think that that's powerful. And then the ruling class is quite conscious, I think. And Jenny Brown just recently wrote a great book called Birth Strike, which is about how birth rates are falling globally. And she documents very well that this is provoking all kinds of anxiety within the ruling class. So for sure. And then I think also in history, Jefferson, my husband's work has been sort of in the Revolutionary era for a while. And so kind of by osmosis, hearing him talk about Jefferson, get very keenly aware of labor as a source of value, because enslaved women, produce new enslaved labor power. So I think this is something that capital wants to manage, ruling classes want to manage fertility regimes, and they have, various goals as they do that.
George F. did it in Johnson City. That's why the women in Endicott had twice as many babies as anyone else in upstate New York. Just gonna say.
Wow, yes, hydrosocialism. Yeah, I mean, along the same lines of what you were saying, Marcy. I don't like to romanticize this. My point is how water was employed by these different machineries. Water belonged to this reciprocal relations with nature and a reciprocal view of nature. But then this was translated and co-opted into the machinery of the state. But my point is that although it has been co-opted by the state, this reciprocal or debt creditor system is still at the base function like a compulsory superego mandate, in a sense, that the more we repress it, the more it comes back under the form of the return of the repressed. In this sense, modes of exchange A have been repressed by mode of exchange B and C, but they return under the form of negation, in the form of these millenarian movements, these Andean movements, these movements that appeal to these retroactive fantasies, because let's face it, what Garcilaso is doing here, he's reinventing the past. He's attributing them a past that then is being recomposed again under his own political agenda, which is to empower the state. And although, in spite of this, these retroactive fantasies have still a revolutionary potential. And this is what some ecological movements in Latin America, the Cochabamba Water Wars, the Network of Women Against Mining, they're all appealing to these rotational systems of exchange, which now appear under the guise of some kind of subversive edge.
Excellent, thank you. Any other questions?
Hi. We briefly mentioned just before you went on. I just wanted you to expand a little bit more on what you meant by ecologies of hope.
Can you tell us your name?
Rosamond. Yeah.
Oh, excellent. And then we'll have Fred. Should we get a stack of three if anyone's got one last one? And then Joshua.
Yeah, just following up and expanding on Orlando's last comment, the biggest struggles in Peru in recent years have been people in the hinterlands of the country that are subject to these huge extractive projects that are diverting large amounts of water into processing of minerals and then disposing of them as wastewater that really just threatens the livelihoods of these communities. And as you say, those struggles are harking back to this tradition of reciprocity and trying to preserve it and expand it and extend it. I was just wondering if you had looked into the work of, let's say, Carlos Mariátegui, who was, of course, the Peruvian Marxist who has many affinities with Gramsci and who did a lot of, discussed a great deal the tradition of and the history of Peru in terms of this, reciprocity and the need for latter-day radicals and socialists to draw upon that and apply it and transform it in progressive ways.
Excellent. Then we'll get Josh's question. That'll be our last one. You guys can answer, and we'll get started with the next set of panels. Just a little bit late.
I enjoyed both your presentations. Question for Marcy very quickly. In the discussion of the working day, there's the sort of discussion of how labor is sort of ground down and used up very quickly. And you mentioned the sort of issue of sort of formal versus real, that the question of appropriation sometimes gets sort of dropped out at times in that discussion. And what appears in that discussion of the working day is the actual geography of reproduction, of reproductive labor. Sort of the emptying of the agricultural districts to work in the bakeries and the transformation of sort of the geographicalization of slave labor is also in that chapter. And so my question is, as you sort of think through this project, which again is like great, what is the history and the geography of sort of appropriation and not necessarily capitalization or real subsumption, but a sort of expanded appropriation in dialectical tension with that? Thank you.
I'm going to piggyback right on top of that and say, one of the things that I kept thinking about, especially after Nora's question, is, the womb acts on its own, and it creates women out of girls. And that becomes the site of production for children, right, labor. And girls don't have any control over that, when or where or how or when that all occurs. And then the same thing happens at the other end. And so when it is no longer a site of production and reproduction, and in the onset of menopause, again, women have no control over when they stop being fertile women and then they're just women. Or however you want to phrase that. But I think that there's a place in your analysis for that, because that really emphasizes the fact that what you're talking about is what the womb does without the consciousness of the body that it's housed in. Fabulous. Okay.
Thank you. Well, yes, and in the reading group we have, you share with me a great article by Weber, was right, who basically opposes Garcia Linera. Garcia Linera more Stalinist view on these stages of development of the state, to Mariátegui, with this romantic notion of nature, which tries to combine the problem of the Indian with the problem of the land, and how in order to find a solution to the problem of the land, we need to find a solution to the problem of the Indian. So yes, Mariátegui is there, and I still remember this article that you generously shared with me. And a quick note I want to say to connect with what you were saying. There is a moment when Elinka Garcilaso is talking about this former barbarians that adore the very different kinds of gods, and those in the coast used to adore Mama Cocha, who was basically like a maternal divinity of water, and those were the worst, basically. That's a perfect example of inferior waters that then had to be tamed and subordinated to
The maternal waters.
The maternal waters are the worst. And this is a perfect example of how of how the Inca, this state-centered Inca reciprocity is co-opting pre-existing forms of reciprocal practices.
Again, something that the body, the woman consciously has no control over is when labor begins. Yeah, okay, I'm sorry, I'm just
Yeah.
reeling
No,
with all
that's-
the implications that are going on here.
These talks
Yeah.
connected really well.
Yeah,
I was like
they really
scribbling
did.
notes the entire
Yeah.
time. Okay, so expand more on ecologies of hope. So I find it really helpful and really hopeful to consider that this generosity principle is already and always present. It's the precondition for everything. And I do think that that is a real ontological threat. I mean, I think that creates a problem for capital because capital needs to impose scarcity, but the reality of life is that there's generosity. There's more than enough. So I think that's one thing that makes me hopeful, is that it's not like we aren't in resistance. Our political program is not in resistance to reality. Ours is consistent with reality. So that's hopeful to me. And then also I think that, the kind of ontological framework I put up here, like self and other, and the way that these are resolved by liberalism. I mean, to take Francois Drabun's argument that capitalism is the last stage of patriarchy, liberalism is the kind of intellectual final stage of patriarchy. And I think that if we're operating within that framework of privacy, equality, liberty, I find that to be very hopeless. But I think the maternal relation embedded in it, and this is not to be romantic, I just think that the kind of fecundity implied, right, which can be terrible, and the power of the maternal can be terrifying and abusive, right? But the fecundity, the principle, the logic of generosity that is implied suggests a different kind of ontology, a different way to resolve some of these tensions between self and other. And I think, I didn't get into that, but I think there's fruitful stuff to be kind of gleaned and thought about there as we kind of negotiate politics very practically in the coming decades. So, the question of history, the history of appropriation, how this fits in. I think I want to talk with you about this more privately to make sure that I understand the question. But what comes to mind is that, if I'm understanding correctly, for me, formal subsumption is about appropriation of existing processes. And yes, capital has been formally subsuming the geography of reproduction, I mean, from the very beginning. And that's part of divorcing workers from the means of subsistence. And other consequences of that is, the division of production and reproduction, and this bifurcated geography, which is an estrangement, it's an alienation, which doesn't help sex relations at all. So it has been appropriated, and that's a problem. But I think that, again, the hopeful part is that it hasn't been able to really subsume the logic of reproduction. This is my argument. And this idea of the postmenopausal woman, I mean, Simone de Beauvoir talks about how the postmenopausal woman has, in many cultures, kind of been identified as a third sex, which I think is really nice, because I think there's a way in which sometimes this conversation can lead in very essentialist, kind of heterosexist directions, but actually, sex and gender, especially in the woman's life cycle, change in a single life cycle. And finally, I think the final question was from whom?
No, I think you got everybody.
Did I get everybody? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, we wrapped it up beautifully. So we are running a little late. We'll go ahead and conclude now, and we'll begin our next talk. Let's try to get it started at 45 after, so in 5 minutes, a shorter break, so that we can not truncate lunch too shortly. So gosh, thank you so much. This was amazing.
Yeah.